Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to enter the debate today on C-35. We spend a lot of time talking about the importance of immigration to Canada, and rightly so. The difficulty, however, is that you almost have to be a Philadelphia lawyer to figure out what the rules and procedures are in order to immigrate to Canada. There is no real consistency in terms of what we tell people at our embassies and high commissions, in terms of what's the job market like in your particular field. How long will it take in terms of the process in general to come to Canada? Under what basis can you come to Canada? And for many people here who want to sponsor relatives, it turns out that, of course, many of them think it's a right rather than a privilege. And not understanding the process, of course, has led to people looking for consultants. And, of course, in some cases, a consultant is really not the appropriate term, given the fact that many of these people have limited, if any, understanding. There are some very good consultants out there, and there obviously are the bad apples. And the difficulty is that as members of Parliament, we are charged with the responsibility of dealing with legislation. And in 2008, the Standing Committee dealing with citizenship and immigration produced 9 recommendations. Now, the question I'd have for the government, of course, is why were they not implemented? If a standing committee, and one of the difficulties around this place, Madam Speaker, is that when a standing committee deals with a particular issue, and they deal with a stream of witnesses, and they debate, and they amend, and they come up with very concrete recommendations, and they are sent to the government, sometimes as if we basically wasted our time. Now, I realize that in 2008 there was a federal election, but since then, these recommendations have not been implemented. And I think that that is absolutely unacceptable when we look at the nature of the recommendations to fix part of the problem. This legislation before the House is not a panacea. It's not going to solve all of the problems. It's not going to solve all the backlogs. It's not going to deal with the financial issues in order to implement the kind of process that we need in place. My office alone, one person is dedicated solely to deal with immigration. Now, I'm not an immigration office. In theory, I seem to be part of an extension of the department, because the department is, in many cases, dealing with the applications that need to be dealt with. We have too many people applying and not enough resources to deal with those applicants. Now, fortunately, I am very blessed with a very committed, dedicated individual who really understands the process after the last 5 years. But I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that the difficulty is that people's expectations and understanding of what is involved is like night and day. And many of these people, of course, are victims of consultants. And it all starts, of course, where they're applying from. And do our embassies and high commissions have the kind of information readily available? Well, one of the recommendations, in fact, Madam Speaker, in this report, which I think was recommendation number 8, clearly indicated in 2008 that we need to have the most up-to-date information, that people really have to be able to understand what is going to be awaiting them if, in fact, they come to Canada, in terms of what's the language skills requirements, what are the job opportunities, housing, etc., etc. The difficulty is that most people enter this process rather blindly. And because they think that there is sometimes a quick fix, they deal with consultants. And as I say, some of these consultants turn out to be obviously more of a problem than a cure. So the Standing Committee in 2008 made 9 recommendations, and one of them clearly, which I think is extremely important, is this whole issue of a standalone agency that deals with this issue in terms of having the summary powers needed to do the job properly. That we, rather than amend the Citizenship and Immigration Act, we need to have a body that has the power to deal with consultants, both from a regulatory standpoint, and some colleagues have talked about the provincial process of many regulatory bodies, but also the power to investigate and the power to really come down on people who mislead, who in fact basically take money for no service really rendered. Immigration is supposed to be important to this country, and yet we have a system which is basically broken. And I would defy anybody to suggest otherwise. You just have to come to any member of Parliament's constituency office in the Greater Toronto area, the Greater Vancouver area, and they'll certainly see the difficulties that members of Parliament deal with. And that's also because we don't have the necessary tools. We don't have a legion of staff that can deal with this. One person, and there's often a lot of burnout because one person dealing with this in particular, it's very difficult. And you hear the most tragic stories of people who want to come to this country for a new opportunity, but again, it's the issue of dealing with this. The last Liberal government, our government in 2005, put $900 million towards trying to deal with the backlog. And that really, again, wasn't enough. The present government, again, not enough. So we have this issue of people then wanting to say, and I'm sure many members of Parliament have been asked, well, how do we speed up this process? How can I fast track? Well, obviously you can fast track one, you can fast track them all, and you can't fast track anyone. So is this legislation going to deal with the problem? Well, it's only going to deal partly with the problem, and obviously we support it going to committee. But again, we have a 2008 Standing Committee report, which has 9 recommendations that if the government had implemented them, and part of that deals with the issues of consultants, we would be, of course, maybe on to something else today. The fact is we continue to try and reinvent the wheel instead of saying, what is the major problem here? If, in fact, we had no immigration policy, how would we create one that would address the economic needs of this country, would address the kind of issues that we as Canadians believe are important, and be able to attract people to this country? But instead, we always deal around the edges. We don't deal with the problems per se. And so a regulatory body, a standalone regulatory body, as recommended by the Standing Committee in 2008, is what's needed. It really needs those powers, as we have said. But again, we seem to, this draft legislation only deals with part of that issue. It doesn't really deal with the significant governance issues that the Standing Committee looked at, and certainly from the testimony of many of the witnesses that came forward. And so we need to deal with that. We also need to deal, Mr. Speaker, welcome, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the fact that we need to be working with our international partners. We need to be able to get better coordination in terms of everything from people smuggling to the fact that people set up shop overseas and say that they're a consultant. And what kind of regulations are there? And they say, well, you know, you can come to Canada and you can do this and that. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that there are so many people who have come to my office and have been drained financially of paying money to certain individuals who at the end say, well, you know, go see your MP. In other words, let the MP now try to deal with the problem that they, in many cases, have created or clearly have been able to deal with. So we need to look at that. That has obviously got to be a part of the solution. And as we know, consultants are often non-lawyers, and they provide advice, and the difficulty is that sometimes they are not up to speed on this. I've held information sessions in my own riding dealing with the process. And you are absolutely dizzy by the time you listen to how this process works, and how do you do this, and can you appeal this, and you have another appeal, and well, what happens if you come in under certain classifications? It really is, as I said, you have to be a Philadelphia lawyer to figure that out. Some of you are probably old enough to remember at least that term. We have these ghost consultants. We have these people who say, well, you know, I can solve your problem. But again, Mr. Speaker, it goes back to the fact that people accept money to give advice, which turns out often not to be very helpful. And so when we have Standing Committee recommendations, the best thing the government could do today would really to embrace those 9 recommendations and move forward. And let's deal with other aspects of immigration. Because again, within those 9 recommendations, we also deal with a standalone body that would deal with this. So again, Mr. Speaker, I think that's part of the solution, but it's not the total solution. Thank you.